My grandfather was born here in 1876, lived here his whole life, and he died when he was 90. And there were large open expanses of sagebrush and grass in the valley, and not nearly the invasion of juniper that we've seen in my time.
My understanding from the folks that have been here a long time and the data we've collected and people that have seen the changes over time is cheatgrass invasion is the #1 issue that we've had in this area.
Sagebrush rangelands cover millions of acres in the Great Basin, including parts of Oregon, California, Idaho, Nevada, and Utah. This land provides a variety of important services, including wildlife habitat, clean water, recreation, and economic opportunities. It also serves as the primary forage base for the region's livestock industry. Many people are not aware that sagebrush communities are one of the most threatened land types in North America. Threats include things like the invasion of exotic species, juniper encroachment, climate change, off-road vehicles, urban development, insufficiently managed grazing, and wildfires. As much as half of this land type has already been lost in the Great Basin, and many of the sagebrush communities that remain are in poor health. This loss can have significant impacts on those who depend on the land for vital services. Repeat photography shows an increase in juniper and pinyon woodlands in many areas throughout the Great Basin since European settlement. This increase has been caused by factors such as fire suppression and livestock grazing at levels we now know were unsustainable. As a result, the vegetation is changing and wildfires are becoming less frequent but more intense.
Juniper on the site we're staying has been here for thousands of years, but it had specific sites that it survived on. Oftentimes, they were the fire-safe sites, both the old pinyon and the juniper. And in the more productive, deeper soil sites that typically had the fuels that were able to carry fire, juniper was basically stayed out of those communities because of reoccurring fires that came through those sites. So now these sites are set up to where we have a huge, maybe a 10-fold increase in fuel load on these sites, but the structure is set up to where it's not easy to get fire through these sites. It takes very severe conditions. So rather than having more moderate or lower severity fires that used to creep through these landscapes, we have these fires that are burning frequently, but when they do, they burn under very, very hot conditions that have very high impact.
Over time, those dense stands of juniper become almost completely devoid of any other thing but juniper. And as a result of that, why you have actually no watershed capacity, or your watersheds can't properly function.
So our concern is we don't want to get rid of all the juniper. Juniper adds a lot of structural diversity to these kinds of communities. But juniper, as it starts moving in on these sites, you first have a few trees, which can be real nice, particularly for a lot of wildlife species. But as juniper increases in density and cover, the shrub component and herbaceous vegetation start to die out. And so you can end up with a lot of problems with such things as just soil fertility, erosion, loss of habitat for a lot of species.
Cheatgrass is an invasive exotic annual grass that is rapidly taking over Great Basin sagebrush communities. Cheatgrass increases the frequency of wildfires, costing millions of dollars for suppression, and displaces native vegetation that is an important source of forage for wildlife and livestock.
Today, what we're seeing is that with active fire suppression efforts, we tend to get a thickening of the sagebrush, a high level of cover, we tend to get some encroachment of this cheatgrass and a weakening of the native species.
Cheatgrass invasion has been a huge problem, and I think we all kind of understand why, but it loves fire. Fire burns really well through it. It outcompetes the natives, and so we're losing the native understory and even the native brush species to cheatgrass due to fire.
Water is an important resource on sagebrush rangelands throughout the arid West. Changes on the landscape cause changes in water flow patterns that can increase runoff, reduce the amount of water available for the growth of new vegetation, and erode valuable soils.
When the juniper move in, they can cause a great decline in those understory species, which then can increase the size and sort of distribution of bare ground. And when you do that, when you increase the bare ground on a site, you can potentially dramatically increase the amount of runoff and erosion that can take place. The consequence of the cheatgrass on hydrology really comes from the fact that you change the fire regimes. You change the fire regimes from what might have been 25 to 75 year return interval to the point where you have cheatgrass burning maybe every 5 or 10 years. So every time you burn a site and remove all of the vegetation, the ground cover, and the litter, then you are potentially opening sort of a window of risk that allows the potential, at least, for increased runoff and erosion.
Sagebrush rangelands are home to a variety of wildlife species that depend on healthy ecosystems for habitat and food.
But anytime we have an invasion of a species that, as juniper or cheatgrass, that alter that traditional landscape, it affects a multitude of species. And it affects those species primarily which rely on those SageSTEP environments. Some of the species primarily affected in the West Basin are some of our grassland bird species, sage thrashers, brew sparrows, grasshopper sparrows. There's a whole multitude of sparrows that occur in that area. But one of the ones that is primary focus and has actually become, if you will, the poster child for sagebrush steppe in the West are sage grouse. Sage grouse rely heavily on sagebrush steppe habitats. A good combination of sagebrush, grass, and forb understory, and when that's replaced by monocultures or degraded by the encroachment of another species or a land use, that ultimately will affect the survival productivity of that species.
I think if it's healthy enough for wildlife, that means that you're taking care of the ground if the wildlife is there, and that means that my livestock will do better.
Changes to sagebrush rangelands can also have an economic impact on individuals who depend on the land for goods and services.
I think they affect the area in general because we lose a lot of the services and products that people want off the rangelands. That includes forage for livestock, changing landscapes due to fire, and reduced recreational opportunities. With cheatgrass, though, I think you lose a lot more, especially as you get into the different fire regimes that the ecologists are talking about, and the impacts on ranches in terms of their forage base. I think with increased fires, you're going to have a lot more difficulty keeping the cattle out on, especially on public land allotments. But even on private land, you may end up losing some of the forage in the early spring.
If I want to stay here and ranch, I have to keep the ground so it will produce for me, or get it back to a state that it will produce. I've seen a lot of people, if they just leave it and don't do anything, then they're going out buying more hay, they're buying more pasture. If I spend the money and improve this ground, I'm getting 4 to 5 times the feed off a certain chunk of ground that I would have before.
In many cases, Active management can help restore degraded sagebrush ecosystems, improving wildlife habitat, forage for livestock, and other rangeland values.
One of the questions that keeps coming up is should we actively manage these particular sites? And some people feel, well, maybe we should just walk away. Maybe these are areas that we should just leave them alone, take off all land use practices, and then they'll be okay. Well, it turns out a lot of these particular sites are in relatively poor ecological condition. They're in conditions that are very much at a tipping point. If you can think of a teeter-totter, for instance, and the current state of the vegetation is right at the fulcrum of the teeter-totter, and the vegetation can go one way or the other. Well, basically, on these sites that we see today, trigger points such as a wildfire moving through these sites will tend to shift this vegetation to a totally different vegetative community.
Well, some people feel that the best thing to do is just kind of let nature take its course. And that's making the assumption, one, is that we can remove the human being totally out of the equation, and we can't.
There are a variety of treatment options that landowners and managers can implement to restore sagebrush rangelands depending on their goals and objectives for a particular site. Treatments can be used to remove juniper and pinyon that have encroached and to revitalize old sagebrush stands and promote the growth of native plants before cheatgrass takes hold of an area. Prescribed fire is one of the tools that can be used to remove juniper and thin sagebrush stands. Prescribed burning uses a natural process to restore rangelands under conditions that are generally more favorable than wildfires.
As far as the benefits, prescribed fire, or fire in general, is a natural process. And so in prescribed fire, it's trying to get fire back on the landscape, put it back into the natural process. It can be cheap if you do it on a large scale. If you do thousands of acres, it's fairly inexpensive per acre cost. But everything that goes along with prescribed burning and the risk associated with prescribed burning, it's a little more difficult. It takes a lot more planning.
I think that prescribed burning is probably the most cost-effective way to rehabilitate a lot of these ranges. And there's just nothing that we've seen that will contain the encroachment or further growth of juniper like a good fire.
Fire can be a useful tool for restoration, but it is not always the best choice. For example, in areas where improving sage grouse habitat is an objective, fire should be used sparingly. Mechanical treatments can be used for juniper removal to encourage understory growth and reestablishment of shrubs. There are a variety of mechanical treatments that can be used depending on the characteristics of the site, costs, and goals for the site.
In terms of what kinds of mechanical treatments to use, in some areas, depending on it, prices vary quite a bit, but we've had good success with just hiring a crew of chainsaw fallers. The advantage of that is they can actually select trees, they can do a thinning. We've had sites that have been thinned down to 5 trees per acre, which still maintains good structural diversity. We've had areas that we had old growth scattered through the site, and the site had been a shrub steppe community with very open scattered trees, and we can go in there and make sure that we leave those old trees and just take the young ones.
In my opinion, it's easier to implement a mechanical project, a mechanical treatment, versus prescribed fire or chemical. I guess it can be more expensive, which can be difficult. You have to acquire the funding for that, but it's pretty easy with mechanical to get a contractor lined up and know ahead of time exactly what you want, and you can manipulate the equipment to do what you want.
We have used chaining, and I'm an advocate of pulling an anchor chain between 2 caterpillars to remove these juniper, and it's been very effective for us.
And a lot of people have a bad vision of chaining, and yet there's probably actually chaining can be a good tool under certain circumstances, and that is if you have to do some seeding. There's been a little bit of the mulching where you have heavy equipment of different types like the bullhog that just basically take the tree down and chip it and mulch it. I think the big concern there is what effect is dumping that much mulch on the ground like that have.
Mechanical treatments can also be used to thin sagebrush and encourage the growth of grasses and forbs.
Some other treatment options that we have include such thing as a mechanical thinning of the sagebrush. Not necessarily to eliminate the sagebrush, but to reduce down the cover, to give that understory native vegetation a chance to recover, to build up its vigor, to make it more resilient to when that fire tends to occur.
Herbicides can be used to thin sagebrush to encourage the growth of native grasses and forbs.
So applying the compound tebuthyron under the trade name of Spike at low enough levels, we want to come in, reduce the sagebrush, to try to give that understory a chance to respond, the persisting sagebrush a chance to respond, provide good seed and a good seed reserve in the soil, so that when, the fire potentially occurs or when cheatgrass tends to increase, we have the vegetation that's capable of kind of stepping up and competing with that cheatgrass and not potentially being lost.
Herbicides such as Plateau can also be used to prevent the growth of weedy plants after other treatments take place. After implementing a sagebrush restoration project, it is important to rest the land from grazing for a time. How long depends on the site characteristics and other factors such as weather.
Then after we reseed an area, why we always have waited at least 2 years to allow those new plants to establish themselves and mature to where they can stand to be grazed or used. We want to make sure that we've got a stand established before we ever think of grazing them.
Look at the vegetation, look at the amount of establishment, look how vigorous the vegetation is growing. But then it becomes very imperative to initiate a proper grazing strategy that really takes care of the overall health and vigor of the species under grazing, so that they're not weakened and again allow cheatgrass to gain a toehold in these particular systems.
One thing I would tell a private landowner is if he treats a site, he needs to think of, and he's hoping that he's going to get new seedlings coming in, he needs to look at that site as a new seeding. And how soon would he go in and plant and graze a new seeding if he wants that new seeding to be successful?
As landowners and managers think about implementing sagebrush restoration treatments, it can be important to consider public opinion and the acceptability of various treatments.
In general, people like treatments that are more natural seeming than those that are less so. So what we find is that people are most interested in the possibility of using prescribed burning or grazing, livestock grazing, as ways to change the character of ecosystems and plant communities. And then there's a second tier, which is mowing and use of the bullhog or chopping junipers down, the sort of mechanical treatments. And then down at the bottom, the least favored are ones that involve herbicides or involve chaining.
Education can be an important tool for increasing awareness and acceptability of restoration and the methods used to achieve different restoration goals.
A lot of it, we know that education makes a difference. And so the more informed citizens are, the more likely they are to understand why we're making land management decisions that we do. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will always agree with them, but it's always helpful for them to know what's going on. And so any sort of public information campaign you can do is helpful. And frankly, you know, we're all neighbors, every single one of us. We have to be, you know, if I'm using herbicide, even if I keep it entirely on my property, my neighbors may very well think that it's going to affect them. And so they have a right to understand what my activities might do to affect their livelihoods, their health, and the landscapes that they look at and enjoy every day.
I think just in terms of restoring and maintaining our natural resources, we need to maintain systems that have high integrity, that can withstand high levels of disturbance and resist invasion by weedy species.
Oftentimes, we don't know what we have until it's lost. Then we start realizing the importance of why we need to care about ecosystem restoration.
Well, I think that range restoration is just something that we've got to encourage throughout the West. I think it holds a lot for the future of wildlife, the future of sustainable ranching in the West.
I like being outdoors. I want to provide the same experience for my family, for my kids, that my parents provided for me, that if they want to stay out here and enjoy this kind of lifestyle, that it will still be here for them.